It was a busy Saturday afternoon at the mall, and Jessie, a 17-year-old high school student, was out shopping with her friends. The mall was buzzing with people, and the scent of fresh popcorn mixed with the noise of laughter and chatter. Jessie had her mind set on a few things. She needed to pick up a new pair of shoes, and maybe some clothes for the upcoming school event. As she walked around, her eyes glanced over the familiar stores. There were the usual groups of teenagers hanging out, kids bouncing from one toy store to another, and older couples sipping coffee at the food court. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Jessie was enjoying herself, her thoughts drifting from one thing to the next as she strolled, looking for deals. Her casual wander led her to a spot she always passed by, the small security station tucked by the escalators. She noticed Officer Harris standing there, chatting with one of his colleagues, a pleasant smile on his face. Jessie had seen him around the mall many times before. He was tall, always dressed in his neat blue uniform, and often seen walking through the halls, making sure everything was safe. His friendly nature made him a familiar figure in the mall. Jessie had waved at him a few times in passing, but today, something felt a little different. Maybe it was because she was feeling good after a week of exams and school stress. She smiled and waved at Officer Harris, who, as expected, waved back. The friendly wave seemed like an ordinary moment, but Jessie couldn't help but feel a sense of comfort in seeing him there. She felt a sense of reassurance whenever he was around, as though his presence made the mall feel safer, even in the middle of all the chaos. As she continued to walk by, the noise of the mall seemed to fade slightly. Jessie didn't think much of it at first. She was just heading toward the shoe store, but then something caught her eye. There was a man standing near the entrance of a popular clothing store. He was looking around in an unusual way, constantly glancing over his shoulder, shifting nervously from foot to foot. His eyes darted from one direction to another, and Jessie couldn't help but notice how strange it all looked. She slowed down, watching him carefully. The man was wearing a jacket, even though the day was warm. His clothes weren't new, but his body language made him stand out. He kept checking the time on his watch, and then looking down at the ground, as though he was waiting for someone or something. Jessie couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about the way he moved didn't sit right with her. It wasn't until she saw the slight bulge in his jacket that a chill ran through her. She quickly glanced away and continued walking, but couldn't shake the feeling. The bulge, hidden just under the jacket, was enough to make her stomach drop. She wasn't sure, but her instincts were screaming at her that something wasn't right. Jessie had read enough news stories to recognize when things might be about to go wrong. The man's behavior, the jacket, the way he was acting, it all pointed to trouble. The feeling of unease in her chest grew, and Jessie's mind raced. She knew she had to act fast before anything escalated, but what could she do? She wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't just ignore it. The crowded mall, the kids running around, and family shopping. It would only take a second for things to spiral out of control. Jessie's heart began to race as she quickly thought of her options, trying to stay calm, all while glancing back at the man who was still standing there, oblivious to her growing concern. Jessie tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. She kept walking toward the shoe store, but her mind kept drifting back to the man near the clothing shop. He was still there, standing just outside the store's entrance, watching the crowd with an odd intensity. Her curiosity was pulling at her, but she also knew that if something was wrong, she had to be careful. Her mind was racing as she debated whether to approach the officer or just ignore it and keep going. But as she walked further into the mall, her eyes kept drifting back toward the man. Something about his stance felt too deliberate. He wasn't just casually waiting, like everyone else. He was constantly checking his watch, tapping his foot, looking around like he was waiting for a signal. His eyes never settled. They kept darting back and forth, as if he were waiting for the perfect moment to act. Jessie felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Then it hit her, the way his jacket shifted as he moved slightly. It was subtle, but she could see the outline of something bulky hidden underneath. It wasn't a backpack or shopping bag. It was something more. The shape was unmistakable, and her mind quickly flashed to stories she had heard in the news about people trying to hide dangerous things under their clothing. Her stomach churned as she realized what she was looking at. The man was hiding something, and it didn't feel right. He had a thick jacket on, despite the warm weather, and the way he kept shifting his weight made Jessie uncomfortable. Her thoughts spun out of control. Was he carrying something dangerous? Was he planning to do something here in the middle of the crowd? Was he planning to cause harm to someone? Jessie didn't want to panic, but she also didn't want to ignore the growing suspicion in her gut. She quickly looked around to see if anyone else had noticed the man, but no one was paying attention. People were too busy shopping, talking, and laughing. The mall was full of people who were just trying to enjoy their day. Jessie knew she couldn't just stand by and hope that everything would be fine. The more she watched him, the more she was sure something wasn't right. It wasn't just the way he was acting, it was his whole presence. He was too out of place. The idea of ignoring it and moving on felt wrong. Jessie had seen enough movies and read enough books to recognize the signs of trouble when they appeared. This wasn't just a random person wandering around. This man had an agenda, and if something was about to happen, she knew she couldn't sit idly by. Her heart pounded as she thought about her next move. She glanced around the mall, but the man didn't seem to be drawing any attention. No one else seemed to notice the strange vibe he was giving off. Jessie's eyes darted back to the officer she had waved at earlier. Officer Harris was still by the escalators, chatting casually with a colleague. Could she alert him without causing a scene? Was it worth drawing attention to herself if she was wrong? But Jessie quickly pushed those thoughts aside. If she was wrong, it was better to be safe than sorry. She had to act now. Her instincts told her this was something serious, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her from doing what was right. Jessie's heart raced as she tried to steady her thoughts. The man near the store was still there, acting just as strangely as before, but now she knew for sure that something wasn't right. She could feel the urgency growing inside her. It wasn't enough just to notice something odd. She had to do something about it. Every second felt like it could make a difference. She looked over to where Officer Harris was standing, still chatting with his colleague, unaware of the tension building up in the mall. Without thinking twice, Jessie made up her mind. She wasn't going to just keep walking, hoping things would be fine. She knew she had to alert the officer. Her instincts told her she couldn't waste any more time, but she didn't want to cause a scene either. It had to be subtle. No one else could know what she was thinking, especially the man who was still standing near the store. Taking a deep breath, Jessie started walking toward the security station. She kept her pace calm, trying to look as casual as possible, but her mind was a whirlwind. Each step felt heavier, but she couldn't back down now. She glanced over her shoulder to make sure the man hadn't moved. He was still there, but now he seemed to be growing more restless, tapping his foot rapidly as he checked his watch again. Jessie could see his fingers twitching as if he was waiting for something, or maybe someone. As she neared Officer Harris, Jessie tried to calm herself. She had to act like it was just another day at the mall. There couldn't be any sign of panic in her movements. She didn't want to make the officer feel like something was wrong unless she was absolutely sure. When she got close enough, she casually waved her hand and said, "Hey, Officer Harris, how's it going today?" She tried to sound casual, like she was just passing by, and decided to stop for a quick chat. He smiled and nodded back, clearly happy to see her. "Hey, Jessie, everything's good. How about you?" For a moment, it felt like any other encounter, but Jessie knew her mind had to stay focused. She tried to keep the conversation light, but her eyes kept flicking back to the man, who was now standing closer to the entrance, his posture more tense than ever. "Well, I was just wondering," Jessie continued, her voice steady. "Have you seen anyone acting strange around here today?" She tried to sound as if she were just making casual conversation, but the weight of her words hung in the air. Officer Harris raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem to be too concerned at first. "Strange. "What do you mean?" Jesse took a small breath and pointed subtly in the direction of the man. "That guy over there by the store. He's been acting a little off. Keeps looking around like he's waiting for something." Officer Harris glanced over in the direction she was pointing. He gave the man a quick look, then nodded thoughtfully. "All right, I'll keep an eye on him," he said, his tone still calm. Jessie felt a small relief in her chest, but she didn't let her guard down. The officer needed to know how serious this might be. "I just thought it seemed a little weird," she added quickly, her voice low. "The way he keeps checking his watch and shifting around. It doesn't look like he's just shopping." Officer Harris' expression changed slightly. He had seen enough in his years of service to recognize when something wasn't right. He gave Jessie a grateful nod. "Good job noticing that, Jessie. I'll go check it out." With that, he straightened up and began to move towards the area where the man was still waiting, now pacing back and forth in a more agitated way. Jessie watched him go, her breath still coming in small, quick bursts. Her heart had calmed a little, but she knew the situation wasn't over yet. All she could do now was wait and hope that Officer Harris could handle whatever was coming next. Jessie stood there, her eyes following Officer Harris as he made his way toward the man near the store. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, but now a strange sense of anticipation settled in. She was doing the right thing, but the uncertainty of the situation was still overwhelming. She kept her gaze on the officer, silently hoping that he could handle whatever the man was up to. As Officer Harris walked closer to the suspect, Jessie noticed how confidently he moved. There was no hesitation in his step, no sign that he was worried about the situation. His calmness was reassuring, but it also made Jessie more aware of the tension that hung in the air. She had done everything she could, but now it was in the officer's hands. She just had to trust him. From her position, she could still see the man pacing nervously, his eyes darting toward the entrances of the stores, then quickly looking back down at the ground. He was on edge, and that only made Jessie's stomach twist with unease. She had a feeling that something was about to unfold, but she couldn't tell what it was. All she knew was that she had to stay out of the way, to not draw attention to herself while the officer did his job. Officer Harris had reached the man by now, and Jessie watched intently, hoping that things wouldn't escalate. The officer didn't approach him in a rush. He stayed at a safe distance, speaking in a calm, measured tone, trying to gauge the situation without alarming the man. Jessie couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the body language. Officer Harris stood tall, exuding authority, but also maintaining a certain level of calmness that seemed to put the man at ease, at least for the moment. She could see the man stop pacing as he spoke with Officer Harris. He didn't appear to be acting as agitated now, though Jessie could still sense something was off. There was an awkwardness in his movements, a nervous twitch in his hands that gave him away. Jessie continued to watch closely, her eyes fixed on the interaction, waiting for any sign that things might take a turn for the worse. Suddenly, the man stepped back, his hand moving toward his jacket. It was subtle, but Jessie saw it clearly. He wasn't reaching for his phone or anything ordinary. The way his fingers brushed the fabric of his jacket made her heart race again. Was he reaching for something else? Something that could turn this situation dangerous? She couldn't tell from this distance, but the thought made her stomach drop. She held her breath, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. Officer Harris didn't seem alarmed by the movement, though. He remained calm, continuing to speak with the man. Jessie could see his eyes narrowing just slightly as he tried to understand the man's next move. It felt like a slow-motion moment, where everything could go wrong in the blink of an eye. Jessie had to remind herself that the officer was trained for this, that he knew what he was doing. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Jessie's legs were starting to ache from standing still, but she refused to take her eyes off the scene. She knew she couldn't intervene. It wasn't her place, but her mind couldn't stop analyzing every detail. Her thoughts raced. Was the man going to try something? Was Officer Harris about to call for backup? What would happen next? Finally, Jesse saw Officer Harris step closer to the man, his body language firm, but not aggressive. He was clearly asking the man to comply, though there was no sign of confrontation. The man's shoulders drooped slightly, and Jesse noticed him pull his hand back from his jacket. She exhaled in relief, but only for a moment. The situation wasn't over yet. Officer Harris was still talking to him, likely asking for identification or some kind of explanation, but Jessie couldn't tell if the situation had been diffused. She stayed where she was, trying to remain as unobtrusive as possible, watching closely as the officer worked his way through the tense moment. Her mind kept running through the possibilities, but she reminded herself that, for now, all she could do was wait and trust that Officer Harris was handling the situation. Jessie stood still, her eyes fixed on Officer Harris and the man he was talking to. Her mind was racing, wondering what was going on in that conversation. She had done her part, but now it was up to the officer to take control of the situation. As she watched the interaction unfold, she felt a small sense of relief, knowing that the officer wasn't reacting with urgency or panic. His calm demeanor seemed to be putting the man at ease, or at least that's what it looked like from a distance. The man, who had been so fidgety and on edge moments before, was now standing still. Jessie couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the exchange clearly. Officer Harris was speaking slowly with authority, but in a tone that wasn't threatening. The man's eyes were downcast, and he seemed to be avoiding eye contact, as though trying to make himself appear less suspicious. He hadn't made any sudden movements since he reached for his jacket, and that gave Jessie some hope. For a brief moment, Jessie wondered if she had overreacted. Maybe the man wasn't dangerous after all. Maybe he was just someone who didn't quite fit in, or perhaps he was nervous about something that had nothing to do with causing harm. She tried to shake off the doubt, reminding herself that her gut feeling had never led her astray before. Something wasn't right, and the officer needed to know about it. Jessie shifted her position slightly, still keeping a careful eye on the situation. She saw Officer Harris take a step back, glancing at the man's jacket one more time. The officer's expression changed ever so slightly. He wasn't smiling now, and his face had become more serious. He wasn't being harsh, but Jessie could tell that he had picked up on something that wasn't sitting well with him. The man's response seemed to be a little more defensive now. He was moving his hands more, shrugging as if to appear nonchalant. But Jessie noticed the quick flick of his eyes toward the entrance of the store. It was subtle, but the officer caught it too. The way he stood, the way he shifted his feet, it wasn't natural. Jessie felt her heart rate increase again. She couldn't tell exactly what was happening, but she had the strong feeling that things were still building to something bigger. Officer Harris, never taking his eyes off the man, spoke with more certainty now. His tone was firm, but not aggressive. Jessie could see the officer asking the man questions, probably about his purpose in the mall, or whether he had any identification. The man shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around once more, but he didn't make any sudden moves. Officer Harris was still calm, taking his time, making sure not to push the man too hard, but Jessie could tell that he was in control of the situation now. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Jessie's eyes locked onto the officer and the man, her breath held in suspense. Was the officer about to call for backup? Was the man going to make a move? Or was this all just a misunderstanding? Jessie kept asking herself questions, but she knew that the officer had everything in hand. She couldn't let her imagination get the best of her, even if her instincts were screaming at her. Finally, Officer Harris took a small step back, keeping his hands at his sides. The man seemed to relax slightly, but not enough for Jessie to feel completely at ease. The officer nodded slowly and spoke again, his voice still calm but with a note of finality. The man, his shoulders slumped, nodded in return. He wasn't making any more sudden moves, and that was enough to put Jessie's nerves at ease, at least for now. She could see the officer take out his radio and speak into it briefly. Jessie's stomach fluttered, but it wasn't with fear anymore. It was more of a sense of relief mixed with curiosity. Was the officer calling for backup just in case? Or was he wrapping up the situation because he had determined it was safe? Jessie couldn't hear what he was saying, but she watched as the officer seemed to make a decision and then walked back toward the suspect, who was still standing there, clearly trying to appear calm. Jessie waited, still standing a little farther off, feeling like she was holding her breath as the scene played out in front of her. The tension hadn't entirely lifted, but it seemed like the officer was getting closer to resolving whatever was going on. Jessie's pulse still raced as she watched Officer Harris take control of the situation. She could see him talking to the man, his posture calm and steady, but there was an air of seriousness that Jessie hadn't noticed before. The man, who had been so nervous and fidgety, was now standing rigid, his hand slightly raised as if he was trying to signal submission. But there was still something off about him. The way his eyes flickered to the side, the way his feet shuffled nervously, it wasn't normal. Jessie couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding. Officer Harris, having taken a step back to reassess, seemed to be waiting for the right moment to act. Jessie could see him scan the mall briefly, probably assessing the surroundings. She didn't know what he was thinking, but she trusted his judgment. He was trained for moments like this. Jessie had no idea what might happen next, but she was certain that Officer Harris was keeping his cool in a way she never could. As the officer continued talking to the man, Jessie noticed a slight shift in his body language. He was slowly inching closer to the man, his hand never leaving his side, but his movements were measured. He wasn't rushing. Every step he took was purposeful. The man seemed to notice this too, his shoulders tightening, but he didn't pull away. There was a moment of silence between them, a tension that Jessie could almost feel. It was like everyone around them was unaware of the growing suspense. Jessie's eyes darted around the mall again, trying to gauge the reactions of the people nearby. No one was watching. Everyone was too wrapped up in their own shopping or talking, oblivious to what was happening just a few feet away. It struck Jessie how easy it would have been for the situation to escalate without anyone noticing. She couldn't help but wonder how many times something like this happened without anyone stepping in. Her attention snapped back to the officer. He was now standing just a few feet away from the man, his posture confident but not threatening. He spoke calmly again, his voice low but steady, as if trying to reassure the man. Jessie couldn't hear the words, but the man's stiff body seemed to soften just a little. He no longer looked like someone preparing to flee. His gaze dropped to the ground, avoiding eye contact with Officer Harris, but Jessie could see his shoulders slowly relax. It wasn't until the officer moved even closer that the tension seemed to break. Officer Harris reached into his pocket, pulling out his badge and holding it up for the man to see. The gesture wasn't abrupt or aggressive, but it was a clear sign that this was no ordinary conversation. The man's hands trembled slightly as he finally looked up at the officer. The weight of the badge seemed to hit him, and he visibly deflated. Jessie held her breath as the officer spoke again. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the man nod, his body language now resigned. There was no fight left in him, no sudden move to make a run for it. Instead, he stood there quietly, waiting for Officer Harris to guide him toward the security area. Jessie exhaled, feeling a rush of relief flood through her. The officer moved first, taking a few steps back and signaling for the man to follow him. The man didn't resist. He walked quietly behind the officer, his head lowered, looking almost defeated. Jessie could see that Officer Harris was still watchful, his gaze flicking over the man's every movement as they walked. It was clear that he wasn't taking any chances. As they passed by Jessie, the officer briefly glanced in her direction, his face a mask of professionalism. Jessie gave him a small nod, trying to convey her gratitude without drawing too much attention. Officer Harris didn't acknowledge her directly, but she could see the hint of a nod in return. She felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. She had done her part, even if it was just by noticing something that others had missed. It was a small thing, but it felt important. The man was now in the officer's custody, walking quietly toward the exit. Jessie watched them disappear into the crowd, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She had trusted her instincts, and it had made a difference. She didn't know exactly what had been going on, but she had a feeling that the situation had been diffused before it could escalate further. For a few moments, everything seemed to go back to normal. People resumed their shopping, unaware of the close call that had just taken place. Jessie took a deep breath, her body finally starting to relax after the tension of the last few minutes. She felt proud, but also exhausted. It had been a small moment, but it had felt bigger than anything she'd experienced before. The mall was buzzing again, just like before, with people walking around, chatting and laughing. It almost felt like nothing had happened at all. But Jessie knew better. The air around her still felt heavy with the tension of what had just occurred. Her heart was still racing, but in a way it was calming down. She'd done what she could, and now the situation seemed to be under control. Still, her mind kept replaying the moments that had just passed. She couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of pride and relief. Pride, because she had acted quickly when something felt wrong. She hadn't second-guessed herself. She had noticed the subtle signs that others missed and trusted her instincts. That had made all the difference. But there was also a sense of relief that nothing had escalated. Officer Harris had handled everything, and the mall was back to normal. It was a victory, but Jessie also knew that things could have gone very differently. As she wandered toward the food court to meet her friends, she found herself replaying everything in her head. She thought about how easily the situation could have gone unnoticed, how one small act of kindness, a wave to the officer, had set everything in motion. Had she not said anything, would anyone have noticed the man's odd behavior? Would the situation have spiraled into something much worse? Jessie didn't want to think about it. She was just grateful that she had followed her instincts. Her friends were already at a table, chatting and laughing, completely unaware of what had just taken place. Jessie sat down with them, forcing a smile as she joined in their conversation. But her mind wasn't entirely with them. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the man and the officer. She had a feeling that the situation wasn't just over yet. A few minutes later, as Jessie nibbled on a sandwich, she saw Officer Harris walking past again. He was alone this time, and his posture was relaxed, his duty for the moment complete. As he passed by her table, he glanced in her direction, and this time he gave her a small, appreciative nod. Jessie smiled back at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. He had handled it all so calmly, and even though she was sure he had more important things to do, he had taken a moment to acknowledge her. It wasn't much, just a simple nod, but it meant the world to Jessie. She knew she had done the right thing, and it felt good to have her actions acknowledged, even in such a small way. She had been afraid at first, afraid of being wrong, of making a mistake, of overreacting. But in the end, it had all worked out. The officer had everything under control, and the danger had passed. Jessie spent the next few hours with her friends, but she couldn't shake the thoughts of what had happened. It wasn't just about noticing the man. It was about the way everything had unfolded. It was about the chain of events that started with a small wave and led to something much bigger. She had learned something important today. Trusting her gut was more powerful than she had realized. It wasn't always easy, but sometimes it could save lives. As the day wore on, Jessie couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the kind of feeling you got from acing a test or winning a game. It was different. It was the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing you had made a difference, even in a small way. She had helped keep her community safe, and that was something to be proud of. The experience stayed with her, not just for the rest of the day, but for much longer. Whenever she passed by the mall's security station from that point on, she'd look at Officer Harris and smile. They didn't need words. They both knew what had happened. Jessie had trusted herself and made sure something bad didn't happen. That, she realized, was something that would always stick with her. And as she left the mall that afternoon, walking out into the fresh air, Jessie felt a quiet pride in the way she had handled the day. It wasn't about being a hero or getting recognition. It was about doing the right thing when it mattered most. And for Jessie, that was more than enough. A few days passed since the incident at the mall, but Jessie couldn't quite shake the memory of what had happened. Each time she walked through the mall, her eyes automatically scanned the crowd, her mind trained to notice even the smallest signs of trouble. It was as though something inside her had shifted. That day had taught her a lot, not just about the importance of trusting her instincts, but about how even small moments could make a big difference. The experience had also brought a quiet sense of confidence. Jessie now saw the world through a different lens. She wasn't just someone who observed. She was someone who acted when needed. It was a feeling she couldn't quite explain, but it was powerful. She knew she had done something good that day, something that had kept people safe, and that made her proud. Her friends had never known the full story. To them, it was just another day at the mall. And Jessie hadn't shared the details of her encounter with Officer Harris. It wasn't that she didn't want to talk about it. It was just that it didn't feel necessary. What mattered was that she had done the right thing. And that was enough for her. But every now and then, when she walked by the security station, she would catch a glimpse of Officer Harris. He would always look her way, give her a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement that they both understood what had happened. It was a simple gesture, but it made Jessie feel like she had made a real impact. The officer might not have said much to her directly, but his small gesture of appreciation spoke volumes. One afternoon, as Jessie was heading out of the mall after a study session, she spotted Officer Harris again. This time, he was standing near the entrance, talking to a couple of new recruits, showing them the ropes. Jessie hesitated for a moment, then decided to approach him. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she just wanted to thank him for how he handled everything, or maybe she just wanted to know if he thought she'd done the right thing. "Hey, Officer Harris," Jessie said, offering a polite smile as she approached. He turned to face her, his usual calm expression on his face. "Hey, Jessie, how's it going?" he asked, his tone warm but professional. "I just wanted to say thank you for handling things that day at the mall," Jessie said, her words a little awkward but sincere. "I'm really glad I said something." Officer Harris nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did the right thing, Jessie. It wasn't easy, and you stayed calm. That's not something a lot of people can do in a situation like that." Jessie felt a rush of warmth at his words. She had always admired Officer Harris for his composure, and hearing that he thought she had acted well made her feel like she had truly made a difference. "I just wanted to make sure nothing bad happened," she said, shrugging slightly. "I didn't really think about what would happen. I just knew something was wrong." "You were right," Officer Harris said, his tone more serious now. "You caught something that others missed, and that made all the difference. We can't always predict when something's going to go wrong, but we can always be alert, and we can always trust our instincts." Jessie nodded, taking in his words. "I guess I learned that day that even the smallest things matter. If I hadn't noticed the man, or if I hadn't said anything, who knows what might have happened." "Exactly," Officer Harris agreed. "Sometimes it's those small, unnoticed actions that prevent bigger problems from occurring. You did your part, and that's what matters." Jessie smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment settle in her chest. She didn't need any more recognition. She had already learned the most important lesson: the importance of being aware, of trusting herself, and of acting when it counted. And with that, she felt ready for whatever came next. As she turned to leave, Officer Harris called after her, "Stay safe, Jessie." His voice carried a note of genuine care, and it made her feel grateful once again. She gave him a quick wave and headed out the door, a sense of calm washing over her as she walked into the cool afternoon air. That day had been a turning point for her. Jessie knew that no matter what happened in the future, she would always remember that moment. The moment when she trusted her instincts, when she acted, and when she made a difference. And that was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life.